Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. The Attorney General and I both appreciate it very much. Late last week, Attorney General Brown and I decided to hold a press conference this morning regarding ICE, what's happening in Minnesota, and our preparations in case a similar ICE presence comes to Washington State. Then, of course, there was another death at the hands of federal agents this weekend in Minneapolis. The victim was a United States citizen, an ICU nurse who worked with veterans, and he was peacefully exercising his constitutional rights. And now he's dead. Over the course of the last year, including on my State of the State address, I have repeatedly spoken about how un-American it is to have masked federal agents in unmarked cars plucking people off the streets and from their workplaces. The recent events in Minnesota have taken this un-American activity to an entirely different level. Now they are killing Americans who are holding a camera. ICE is, to be blunt, completely and totally out of control. To say that I'm angry is not the right word. I don't have the right word for how I feel about it, or I'm sure how Attorney General Brown feels about it, or how people all across our country feel about it. It's outrageous in the extreme, and it has to stop. As angry as we both are, we are focused on preparing to the fullest extent possible for a similar escalation by ICE against our will here in Washington State. Before I outline our preparations, I want to make two important points directly to the people of Washington State. First, Attorney General Brown and I cannot stop ICE from being in our state. We don't have that power. No governor has that power, and no Attorney General has that power. On the other hand, we are not passive bystanders to what is happening, and we are prepared to use every tool at our disposal to mitigate against the harms inflicted by ICE. Furthermore, no state in this country has a governor and attorney general who have the level of experience the two of us have confronting the Trump administration and defeating the Trump administration. And we are each blessed with excellent teams who have deep experience in this area as well. I will briefly outline 5 steps we are taking. This is, of course, a non-exclusive list, but want to give a sense to the people of the work that we're doing right now. First, the memo to ICE agents instructing them to use force to enter people's homes without a warrant from a judge is outrageous. It is disturbing. It is deeply un-American, and it is most certainly unconstitutional. Just a few minutes ago, Attorney General Brown and I signed a joint letter to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. That letter covers multiple points, but importantly, it makes clear that the directive in that memo is certainly unconstitutional. In short, ICE cannot authorize itself to break into somebody's home. In our letter, we emphasize that if ICE attempts any such unconstitutional measures in Washington State, we will use every legal option available to us to hold the federal government accountable. We also make clear in our letter that we will use every legal option available to hold individual ICE agents accountable as well. Washington State remains the national leader in holding the Trump administration accountable to the rule of law. That important work will continue, specifically when it comes to ICE. The Constitution matters. We will defend it and ensure the people of our state are safe and secure in their homes. Second, I'm making some changes in our organization to help us coordinate our efforts in regard to ICE activity in Washington State. As you know, in September, I signed an executive order creating our immigration sub-cabinet, which helps state agencies coordinate on issues related to immigration. This group is doing important work. The issues that led me to create this group have only gotten worse since that time, and we have obviously reached a new level of crisis. Issues impacting immigrants and refugees are changing every day. Consequently, effective today, Sarah Peterson, she's the chief of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Assistance, will begin attending my cabinet meetings. Having Sarah in our cabinet meetings will help ensure we are coordinating as a state and between agencies to respond quickly and thoroughly to new threats from the federal government. I also recently hired a senior advisor specifically for immigrant and refugee issues. David Kim will handle our work on immigration policy. He is working with communities all across our state to make sure their concerns are elevated to my team and to my office. Third, I'm aware that Governor Walz called up the National Guard in Minnesota to help address the crisis created by ICE. I met yesterday with General Welsh of our National Guard. We discussed what is happening in Minnesota. I will not go into detail about that conversation for reasons I hope you understand, but I want the people of our state to know that I'll take whatever steps are necessary to keep our residents safe. Fourth, we're having many conversations with our state and local partners. For example, later this morning, I'll be meeting with all of our statewide elected officials to ensure we are all coordinated and using our respective tools to protect Washingtonians. We'll also be meeting with mayors, law enforcement, local leaders, and our federal leaders like our federal delegation. These conversations are important to make sure there are clear lines of communication between these local communities and my team. Fifth, and lastly, the legislature has an opportunity in this short session to take meaningful steps to mitigate against the incursion of ICE, and I appreciate their hard work in this area. In my State of the State address, I mentioned the proposal to bar law enforcement from wearing face coverings. I asked that Senate Bill 5855 move quickly to my desk for signature. That legislation has already passed the Senate Committee on Law and Justice. I am disappointed every Republican on the committee voted against it. I hope they reconsider their position in light of recent events. I'm working with Senator Adrian Cortez and Representative Edwin Obras on legislation to prohibit individuals who are not law enforcement officers from making, providing, or possessing badges or other law enforcement insignia. Those bill numbers are Senate Bill 5876 and House Bill 2165. If you're not a law enforcement officer, it needs to be illegal to wear something that gives the impression you are. CNN found there were more ICE impersonation incidents in 2025 than the prior 4 presidential terms combined. Our bill passed the House Committee on Community Safety last week, and I was very glad to see that was a bipartisan vote. Attorney General Brown will speak about important legislation that he is working on as well, and I, of course, support his efforts in this area. I began my comments by speaking about the recent events in Minnesota. I want to emphasize that in the face of cruel and unconstitutional actions, the people of that state are stepping up and helping one another in often deeply moving ways. I see that in Washington State as well. And if ICE escalates their presence in our state, we will need even more Washingtonians to step up and to help. I have said many, many times over the last year that we all have agency in defending our democracy, all of us. Whatever our station in life happens to be, we all have a responsibility to speak out, peacefully make our voices heard, and assist our fellow Washingtonians. We will not allow this administration to turn our nation into an authoritarian regime. That is not our America, and we will not allow this administration to change that. With that, I'm going to turn to Attorney General Brown, who, of course, is doing fantastic work in regards to many issues, but I particularly appreciate his hard work on really helping to lead the country, on holding this administration to the rule of law, and of course he has a fantastic team, and it was a pleasure to see many of them this morning as well. Attorney General Nick Brown.
Thank you, Governor. I come to the microphone this morning as one of many Washingtonians struggling to process the recent events in Minnesota, asking myself and talking to my family about what it means for my neighbors and for my state. I also come to the microphone with years of experience working with the federal government and spending much of my career as a law enforcement officer with the Department of Justice, trying to do everything I can to keep Washingtonians safe. And I know that right now, Minnesota is less safe because of the federal presence in that state. America is weaker because of the operations in Minnesota. And real people all across this country are now traumatized, injured, and dead because of this president's fascist tendencies. What we're seeing right now coming from Washington, D.C. is motivated by hate and bias, and it is guided by the whims of the president, not the facts, not the courts, and certainly not the United States Constitution. This violence has widely been met with Minnesotans' love of their community and not hate or harm. And the vast majority of people that you see in the streets in Minnesota, they're not radicals. They are everyday people who are coming out to support their community, pouring out into the freezing cold in Minnesota to support one another. For anyone across the country, anyone in this state, no matter your background, no matter your political party, no matter how much you've been paying attention, if you are not horrified by what we've been seeing from federal agents in Minnesota, shooting a man on the ground, shooting a woman in her car, kicking down doors without warrants, jailing clergy, arresting children. I just have to pray that anyone not outraged by this, that they will come through the fog of lies from this administration, that they will come out of this institutionalized lawfulness. This may be the authoritarian America that Donald Trump wants. Indeed, I think it is exactly what he wants. But I do not believe that this is why the majority of voters put Donald Trump back into the White House. I refuse to accept that such a reductive and deceitful excuse for the erosion of our civil rights is acceptable. For the president to keep getting away with this, he needs America to stay divided. He needs America to be scared. He needs Congress to be paralyzed, and he needs the Supreme Court to stay pliant. Other branches of government do not get a free pass here, not when the executive branch is governing by fear. We need the full voice of the people and other branches of the government to rein it in. The ICE memorandum that the governor spoke of mentioned it basically instructs agents to ignore the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, to throw it in the trash. That represents a constitutional crisis at the level of everything the founders of this country warned us against, warning us against the tyranny that could arise if we put our heads in the sand. Checks and balances are more essential than ever if we want America that is both governed fairly and policed fairly. Judges sign warrants as a neutral party. ICE is not a neutral party, and it has no oversight today. These masked federal agents who roam the streets of Minneapolis have usurped the role of judges and flagrantly violating the Fourth Amendment. The Constitution protects our homes from the kind of invasion by law enforcement because the founders had lived under a royal government that abused its authority. But the Fourth Amendment prohibits the unreasonable searches and requires warrants based on probable cause because our homes are sacred. The president campaigned last year, or in 2024, on targeting the worst of the worst. But there are tens of thousands of arrests that show this has not been the case at all. If you're going to go after the worst of the worst, you don't target parents dropping their kids off at their preschools. You don't go to hospitals. You don't go to places of worship. And you sure as hell don't use children as bait. You don't go to job sites daily or lay in the wait for people to show up to take their citizenship test. They do not care what the Constitution has to say about the limits of their authority. The president certainly has no inclination to abide by the Constitution. He is doing whatever he wants to people because he believes he has the power to do that. Last spring, I talked about what we were seeing early in the administration as seeing elements of fascism, and yet I am still surprised. And what shocks me most is the lies coming from the president and his team, and the contempt for the idea of finding some humanity and some effort to unite this country. That is because the president and everyone around him seems to relish in degrading people. They're having fun, holed up on compounds and resorts, toasting each other, naming buildings after one another, accepting somebody else's Nobel Prize, and cheating in golf. Everything but governing. They seem utterly disconnected from the real world and the consequences of everyone outside their little cabal of cruelty. People have asked what we can do if ICE descends on Washington State, as they have in Minnesota. And I will not speculate on our strategy. I'm not going to hand our playbook to them. But I can tell you that my staff, working closely with Governor Ferguson, have monitored the situation in Minnesota and Minneapolis very, very closely. We are very well aware of the litigation filed by the state and local governments there. We speak with our colleagues in Minnesota AG's office on a regular basis. We have also been in touch with immigration and advocate voices since day one to track the federal actions that are going on in our community. And you should all know by now that when we can and do, we move quickly on the legal front when the civil rights of Washingtonians are being threatened. The people of this state can be assured that if we see this happening on our streets and in our neighborhoods, we will do everything within our authority to stop it. I also just want to speak how exhausted the public feels right now because of the unrelenting inhumanity coming from this administration. We need the public's help. We need to be people to understand that this is just a point in time in American history. We do not need to abandon our principles and that we will see better days. Those of us who care about the Constitution must also resist the urge to merely hunker down and try to survive these next few years. Instead, we must be persistent. We must pursue every action that we can at a state and local level to push back. We must advance some of the measures that this legislature is considering, including the ones that Governor Ferguson mentioned. I'm particularly mindful of our legislation, the Immigrant Worker Protection Act, which will put workers on equal ground with their employers and give them notice of when ICE comes to their workplace to try to raid their workplaces. Perhaps Thurgood Marshall put it best more than 30 years ago when he said, "We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear and the hatred and the mistrust. We must dissent from the poverty of vision and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better." Thank you again.
Thank you, Attorney General Brown. Thanks again to all of you for being here, and we're happy to answer any questions that individuals have. Yes.
Governor, you said that you would use every legal option available to hold federal government as well as individual ICE agents accountable. Can you talk about that, elaborate on what some of those legal options are that you could do in a scenario like that?
You know, the Attorney General may want to weigh in, but I think the Attorney General said it well when he said he doesn't want to lay out the playbook for the federal administration. That's a perspective I had as well as Attorney General, which makes sense when you're dealing with this administration. What I will say, and then the Attorney General may want to add to that, is I think one reason why Washington State has done exceptionally well at holding the administration accountable in this term and the previous one is everybody works hard to anticipate what might be happening. We don't simply wait around for an event to happen. We try to anticipate that and do a lot of legal research in anticipation, sometimes even drafting complaints before something actually happens. So we're not just ready, but we're ready to actually act right away. And so what I can say is, the Attorney General and I are having conversations about this. Our teams are coordinated, and we're preparing for a range of potential actions by the federal government. There are some circumstances where we can't file a lawsuit, right? That's the nature of the law sometimes. But I think it's certainly fair to say that if in the judgment of the Attorney General that we have the legal ability to challenge what's going on, we're not shy about doing that. That is an understatement. And they don't just do that, they're literally leading the nation as we have in the past. So again, I don't want to get into details about that. I'll let the Attorney General add anything he might want to that question.
Thank you, Governor. Yeah, what I would say is that if we can take action, we will. We certainly don't know what our legal actions or options will be because we do not know what the federal government will do here. What we have seen thus far is truly unprecedented in the way that they have approached and abused their federal authority, that the way that they ignore court orders, the way that they seem to disregard the Fourth Amendment. But we will be prepared to respond to anything that happens here in which we can intervene and act on behalf of the people of Washington State. The other thing I would say about what's happening in Minnesota is it's not happening in a vacuum. The reason that the president feels so comfortable violating the United States Constitution is because since day one he has been acting that way and Congress has let it pass. From the beginning, Congress has really been scared, fearful, in hiding to push back against this president. And he can act with disregard for our Constitution today because of what happened a year ago. Because from day one, he started with violating the United States Constitution by signing an executive order to try to end birthright citizenship. What has been so important over the last year is to try to push back against that. That is why we've been involved in 50 lawsuits to date, because we need and we understand that in order to prevent and do everything we can to mitigate the harms like we're seeing in Minnesota, we need to push back against every single thing that is unlawful and simply not look away and accept it as normal. And I've been so proud to work with my colleagues across the country and other states. As I said earlier, we've been in really close contact recently with Minnesota to understand and support what they're doing. And if that happens in Washington State, we will be prepared to respond just like Minnesota has responded.
Governor, you mentioned you don't have the ability to keep the ICE agents out, but you're hoping that some legislation could control what they do.
Yes.
On the coverings, realistically, do you think that would be something they would follow? And if they didn't, what authority would the state have to enforce that?
Yeah, our job would be to take them to court, and judges would determine that. And so we're not going to be shy about that. We've worked hard on crafting that legislation, on working with the legislature. I think it's extremely important. As I said in my remarks, you know, it's, I mean, if you just stop and think about it for a moment. In the United States, federal agents are roaming around with masks. I mean, it's third world country stuff, right? It is. And I realize it gets normalized. You see it, and there's some sense of seeing, and you kind of get used to it, but we just can't get used to that. And so that's why I appreciate the legislature moving quickly on this. We need to make a statement about this. That's not going to happen in Washington State, and we are certainly ready to defend that law if it's challenged by anybody. So I think it's an extremely important piece of legislation, and you know, these ICE agents, you know, at least have the guts to show your face if you're going to be violating people's rights. They lack those guts. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Nick.
Well, I think, you know, to your point, Homeland Security, immigration enforcement, federal law enforcement has been doing immigration enforcement now for decades in the United States of America. What is different now are a few things. Before, they didn't target you in your churches. They didn't target you in your schools. They didn't target you at courthouses. They did not seem to relish in locking people up. They did not seem to relish in targeting children or ignoring people's humanity. And the other big difference, it really, for me, was crystallized in the last 48 hours, is that the lead of Homeland Security lies to the American people on a regular basis. Hours after Alex Preddy was killed this weekend, the head of Homeland Security called him a domestic terrorist. A domestic terrorist, which is blatantly false. Then the head of the border officers that are operating in Minnesota said that he came out planning to mass execute law enforcement. Another blatant lie. And they feel comfortable doing that. And after the shooting and death of Renee Good just a week or two ago, the administration declared in short order that federal officers have absolute immunity, that there would be no investigation, and that everything that happened there was above the board. What do you think that message is then to every single federal law enforcement officer operating in Minnesota? That they are going to have any check on their conduct? That there are going to be any accountability for what they do? No, it's the exact opposite. That they have free rein to violate people's civil rights, to break state and federal law, and that no one is going to hold them accountable. And that is what happens when you have the president leading with the words and hate that he does, that his closest advisor, Stephen Miller, spews racism on a regular basis. And that is what happens when the head of Homeland Security immediately calls American citizens, a nurse who provides help for veterans, a domestic terrorist. And the entire infrastructure that is meant to check that has put their head in the sand, has backed away, is so scared to say anything to their cult leader, Donald Trump. That is why we are here today, because they have operated at a different level. We need immigration enforcement in this country, from my perspective. But we need to do it in a way that follows the damn law and respects people's humanity and is honest and transparent. And that is not as what is happening in this year or in the entire Trump administration.
Other questions? Yeah.
So, to be clear, do you have any indication that a similar crackdown is coming here?
So obviously we don't get information from the federal government. So no, to answer your question directly, there's no specific information we have. That said, it's important that we are clear-eyed about what's going on around the country. And look, I talked to too many people who, when I say we should be prepared for a certain thing in Washington State, we're like, you know what, I don't think that's going to happen, Bob. I don't think they're going to do that. They're focused somewhere else. Like, I'm sorry. I have a fundamental disagreement with that approach. Okay. Our job, my job, the Attorney General's job, all of our jobs here is to make sure that we are doing everything we can to prepare for a worst-case scenario. I'm a big believer in that in life in general, and certainly in a case like this, where we have ICE agents conducting themselves in the way that we're seeing that is so deeply, deeply disturbing. So, no, there's no specific information, but my approach, at least, is to make sure that we're doing everything humanly possible to prepare for that. And I think these lines of communication will be important. I'm thankful we have an AG's office that is as good as they are on these issues. I know that from firsthand experience, obviously, but that is something that I deeply appreciate at a time like this, and we're going to do everything we can to be prepared. Yes?
So you mentioned earlier that you met with leaders of the National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
At what point would you consider activating the National Guard?
Yeah, so to be specific, I met with General Welsh yesterday. And so the question about at what point, obviously that's something that we'll be having to think about as time goes forward. And, that decision's an important one. But, while I can't stop ICE from coming into Washington State, I do have certain tools that I have to do the best that I can to protect the public and to make sure that things are safe in our state. And one of those tools is bring up our National Guard to help protect Washingtonians. So, of course, we'll see how things develop. But the General and I had a good conversation to talk about what's going on in Minnesota, to get his perspective, and to chat through different scenarios. And so that's where we're at right now. Obviously, we'll be continuing those conversations, and that's just a judgment call. But what I would say is I'm not going to be shy about doing that if I think it's necessary to help protect the people of our state. That's the criteria for me. Yeah.
Just clarify two
Mhm.
things on
Yeah.
that. So do you envision the Washington National Guard would be deployed if necessary to protect public spaces, sort of a buffer between the federal agents and maybe public protest?
Mhm. That's a fair way to put it. Yeah. Mhm.
And then secondly, on the accountability question, can, in your opinion, local law enforcement and state patrol detain a federal law enforcement officer they see doing something that violates state law?
So do you want to speak to that? Sure. Yeah, I'll let the Attorney General speak to that.
It's obviously incredibly complicated when you're talking about the division of authority between state law enforcement, local, and the federal government. What I would say is, as a general matter, state and local law enforcement do not have to simply watch or look away if the law is being violated. If they see somebody being assaulted unlawfully or attacked unlawfully or otherwise having their legal rights violated, we do not expect state and local officers to simply watch or do nothing. It is important that each of those jurisdictions talk to their lawyers and legal teams, understand where those lines are drawn, and after an incident, the lines of investigative authority or prosecutorial authority can be very challenging to navigate. But I think the Washington public expects their local sheriff or local police chief or officers that work for either to not simply watch if somebody in their community is having their rights violated. We hope we're not ever in that circumstance in Washington State, but I think as a general matter, that is the expectation, if not the duty, that we would anticipate our local forces having.
Cannot, Washington on the state law that could make an officer liable for not acting if they see misbehaving colleagues?
I'll just say it's complicated, but happy to have the team follow up.
And the only I'll add to that, Jerry, is it's also part of what we're going to continue doing is having a lot of conversations with, I mentioned, I think, in my remarks, right? That's local elected officials, local law enforcement, et cetera, to make sure everybody clearly understands, my perspective of what we need to do to make sure Washingtonians are safe. So the Attorney General is 100% right. This is extremely complicated, obviously. So we want to be thoughtful in how we answer these important questions. But we'll be mindful about the law and at the same time making sure that we are doing everything we can to protect Washingtonians. Yeah.
Governor, do you, actually maybe a question for both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any concern that grassroots groups that are organizing to, report ICE activity and kind of monitor it, might be ill-equipped for the task. We've seen some misinformation that had some schools in Seattle and Bellingham shelter in place that turned out to be somewhat unsubstantiated. Do you have any concern that those grassroots groups, do you have advice to people who are looking to report ICE activity?
Sure, I'll share a couple thoughts, and the Attorney General and I were chatting about this just before we walked out here, so I'll let him add his thoughts as well. So first I would say what I see in Minnesota, for example, under very extreme circumstances, and what's happening here is I see community and individuals, grassroots organizations doing their part to stand up for their fellow residents of Minnesota and fellow Washingtonians here. So I appreciate that work. And look, to the extent there's going to be, you mentioned the schools being, there's a climate of fear going on right now, and I can't blame folks, for acting when they hear information. Truly. That's not their fault. That's the fault of the Trump administration and what ICE is doing. Let's be very, very clear about that. They're creating the situation. They're creating the climate of fear. That's them. So I would say I appreciate what they are doing. And what I would also add is that if things continue to escalate, if that happens here in Washington State, we'll need to depend on those folks to partner with us on making sure that conduct of ICE agents is being recorded, which is deeply helpful, as we saw this weekend in the face of the lies that came from federal officials. Well, the cameras are what the cameras are. The video is what the video is. You can deny reality if you want, but that's reality. So again, what I really want to emphasize, and I'll turn this over to the Attorney General, is we have certain powers as Attorney General or governors to do our part, but everybody has a role in our state right now on defending our democracy. Everybody does, and we're going to need that to get through this. We really are.
Yeah, I would just say as a general matter, we encourage people to report anything that concerns them. It is our job, and it's the job of state and local, both regulatory agencies and law enforcement agencies, to work through the information that we get to respond to some of the concerns. But one of the things that I most enjoy about being the Attorney General of this state is that every single one of our cases is told on behalf of someone in Washington, and we rely on that partnership and coordination with both advocates and individuals alike. And we get that information through our Civil Rights Division. We get that information through our just main intake lines. We get that information through our hate crimes hotline. The more information that we can receive for people expressing their concerns, the better. And it is so important that that information continue to come because, as the governor noted, we know what we know about Minnesota because of people reporting, not because CNN was on the ground at the time, but because somebody local in that community, often an advocacy group, sometimes just a bystander who's watching, has reported that information. And that is true really in the last few recent years. We know so much more about the good and the bad of government misconduct and actions because people sharing their stories with us. And so we need to be able to continue to encourage that moving forward, because it is more important than ever that people don't shy away from that, that they're not, what Donald Trump wants is for people to hide, to not tell, to not report, to not record. He wants people to be scared. There's been so much talk in the last few days about ICE training and misconduct. Where we are now is because Donald Trump wanted this. He wanted to operate in fear. He wanted to be the authoritarian. And we cannot cower away from our responsibilities as citizens to continue to report about what the government is doing.
So we appreciate all of you being here today. I want to thank the Attorney General Brown, his excellent team, for their hard work. And we obviously will stay in touch with the public as things develop if we get more information related to what might be happening here. But just want to make sure that Washingtonians know that we have a lot of hardworking people in state government who are working extremely hard to make sure we're prepared. We are very determined to make sure we use every tool we have to stand up for people's rights in the state. And we're going to use those tools. We're not shy about that. The Attorney General's not. I'm not. That's not our style. And so we're prepared for that. It will not be an easy time for our state for the next few years, but we're determined to work hard to get through it. Thanks so much, everybody. We appreciate it.